What do you think is more frightening in the Klondike? Running out of gold, or knowing that someone is secretly stealing it right from your own land? For Tony Beets, the man known as the gold boss of the gold rush, risk, blizzards and million-dollar machine breakdowns were nothing new. But that morning at Paradise Hill, what sent a chill down his spine wasn't the weather or a technical failure. It was the digging marks that clearly didn't belong to his crew. During a routine inspection in a remote eastern section of the mine, Tony discovered several freshly dug pits scattered across the still damp clay. These holes were about 1.8 meters deep and nearly 2.4 meters wide, dimensions that indicated they were made with professional machinery, not random hand digging. The cuts were clean, the waste piles were systematically arranged, and most striking of all was the uncanny precision of their locations. When Tony pulled out his confidential geological map for comparison, his heart nearly stopped. The pits matched almost perfectly with survey data from 3 years earlier, areas marked as having the highest gold potential. This information had never been made public. Only his family and a few senior managers had access to it. That led to only one possibility. This wasn't a sleuthy gold seeker. This was an organized operation. And worse, it was very likely that someone on the inside had leaked the information. In a barren land where every ounce of gold is paid for with sweat and money, Tony realized he wasn't just facing theft, he was facing betrayal. The most terrifying part wasn't the newly discovered pits. It was when Tony began to realize the signs had been there all along. He just hadn't seen them. Tony Beets was known for tightly controlling every number at Paradise Hill, but in late July that year, diesel consumption reports showed an unusual increase of 10 to 15%, even though the workload hadn't changed significantly. At the time, he assumed older machines were simply burning more fuel, or that the terrain conditions were tougher than usual. No one considered the possibility that equipment was being used off hours. In early August, Kevin, the chief mechanic who had worked with Tony for 15 years, noticed something else strange. Several heavy excavators at Paradise Hill had been repositioned overnight. They were normally parked facing north for the next morning's shift, but now they were turned west, as if they had just completed work elsewhere. No one on the team admitted to moving them. When asked, everyone assumed it was just a shift mix-up. By mid-August, security cameras captured footage of a truck resembling an employee vehicle entering the eastern boundary at 2 a.m. The image was blurry and the license plate unreadable. No work logs recorded any activity in that area at that time. But when Tony reviewed the footage, he was dealing with a series of operational issues at other sites. He brushed it off, assuming someone had returned to pick up tools or check equipment. Individually, each detail could be explained. But when pieced together, they formed a troubling pattern. Fuel going missing, machinery being moved, a truck appearing at dawn, all pointing to the exact area where illegal digging would later be discovered. Tony later admitted that what haunted him most wasn't the amount of gold that might have been taken, but the fact that he had been too busy running multiple mines to notice the early warning signs. In the Klondike, a small mistake can cost an entire mining season. This time, the cost might be greater than gold. It could be the trust within his own team. When suspicion was no longer just a theory, Tony Beets was forced to do what he hated most: call the police. For a man who had built his empire with sweat and iron discipline, allowing outside authorities into his gold mine felt like admitting he had lost control. But this time, he had no choice. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, quickly arrived at Paradise Hill. They sealed off the eastern area, collected deep tire tracks in the mud, fresh footprints, and samples of the spoil around the pits. Preliminary analysis suggested at least 3 people were involved. More importantly, traces of gold were found in the discarded soil, proof that the intruders weren't just scouting, they had actually taken something. The investigation quickly narrowed to a troubling group: those with access to geological survey data and the ability to operate heavy machinery. The list was short, and every name on it was someone Tony had once trusted. Kevin, the loyal mechanic of 15 years, had access to the office and understood the storage system. Excavator operators knew every meter of the terrain with the skills to dig precisely and erase traces. The atmosphere in the camp changed overnight. Conversations grew shorter, eyes began to watch one another. Tony imposed strict security measures, limiting access to records, requiring detailed shift reports, and conducting daily fuel checks. He did it to protect the mine, but the cost was a shaken team spirit. Kevin couldn't hide his hurt when he realized he was also under suspicion. After 15 years of dedication, being placed under scrutiny felt like an attack on his honor. Paradise Hill had been built on discipline and loyalty, but now the silence hanging over it was heavier than the roar of excavators. Tony understood that if the truth wasn't uncovered quickly, he wouldn't just lose gold, he would lose something far more valuable: the trust of the very people who had helped him build everything. After days of working with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Tony Beets realized that investigation alone wasn't enough. There was no direct evidence, no witnesses, and if there truly was an insider, that person wouldn't act again knowing they were being watched. So Tony chose a more dangerous approach: create a false opportunity. One tempting enough that the traitor wouldn't be able to resist. He and Mike secretly fabricated an internal story about discovering a new strip of land with unusually high gold reserves in another remote corner of Paradise Hill. This information wasn't widely shared, only disclosed within a limited circle, so that if it leaked, the source could be easily traced. Tony deliberately acted excited, discussing it in front of key personnel, as if he were preparing for a major breakthrough in the mining season. At the same time, a covert surveillance system was set up. Infrared night cameras were hidden inside fuel containers and behind gravel piles. Motion sensors were buried beneath freshly leveled ground. None of it appeared in the main camera system the crew was familiar with. The RCMP was informed in advance and stood ready to intervene the moment any intrusion signal was triggered. Paradise Hill suddenly became a carefully staged trap. During the day, everything carried on as usual: excavators running, conveyor belts turning, workers going about their jobs as if nothing had ever happened. But at night, the entire site seemed to hold its breath. Tony barely slept. He wasn't just waiting for a thief, he was waiting for the answer to the question that had haunted him for weeks. Was the traitor sitting at the dinner table with him every day? Every gust of wind rattling the cabin made his heart pound harder. When you've placed a lifetime of trust in a team, the most painful part isn't losing gold, it's having to set a trap for the very people you once considered family. 8 nights passed in tense silence. Not a single movement, not a single signal. Paradise Hill lay frozen in the harsh cold of the Klondike, as if the land itself was testing Tony Beets' patience. Then at 2:47 a.m. on the 8th night, the monitoring screen inside Tony's cabin suddenly flickered. A motion sensor was triggered. A heat signature appeared exactly at the new gold site he and Mike had set up as bait. Tony didn't say a word. He simply looked at Mike, and the two quietly switched on the night vision equipment. On the dim green screen, 3 figures emerged. A small excavator was in operation. A portable wash plant sat right at the edge of a pit. They worked quickly, efficiently, precisely. Not reckless amateurs, but people who understood mining operations. Tony's heart pounded heavily in his chest, not because of the gold that might be taken, but because of how familiar their handling of the machinery looked. This was the style of someone who had worked here before, someone who knew every meter of land, every access route. When officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, moved in from 2 directions, the figures barely had time to react before being restrained. And then, under the cold beam of flashlights in the dark, the face of the ringleader was revealed. Tony froze. It was Brad, an excavator operator who had worked for him for more than 3 years, the man who had been trusted with the toughest sections, the man who had shared meals with the team after long days. There was no explosive anger like one might expect, only a heavy silence. In his later statement, Brad admitted to selling geological data to 2 outside individuals in exchange for a share of the gold. He said he was desperate because medical bills weren't covered by insurance. He said he had no other choice. But for Tony, the choice had been made the moment Brad decided to betray him. That night, Paradise Hill didn't just catch a thief, it exposed a deep fracture in trust. And for Tony, the greatest pain wasn't the gold that had been taken. It was realizing that someone he had trusted had been quietly digging away at the very foundation he had spent a lifetime building. After the arrest, Paradise Hill became eerily quiet. The machines still ran, gold was still processed, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. For Tony Beets, any sense of victory was almost non-existent. He had found the traitor, but the price was a crack in the team he had spent decades building. In the days that followed, Tony tightened security more than ever. Geological records were locked behind multiple layers, cameras were reinforced, shift reports tracked every liter of fuel. The gold mine began to feel more like a fortress than a workplace. And that was when Minnie Beets, the one who had always balanced her husband's tough decisions, spoke up. Minnie reminded Tony that Paradise Hill had been built not just with machines and gold, but with loyalty. If he turned it into a prison of extreme surveillance, he might protect the assets, but he would destroy the culture of trust that had held the team together for 4 decades. One traitor could not represent everyone. Her words made Tony reflect. He looked at Kevin, who had endured suspicion despite being innocent. He looked at the workers who still showed up every day despite the heavy atmosphere. And he realized that if he allowed suspicion to continue ruling, he would destroy something more valuable than gold with his own hands. In the end, Tony made a decision that surprised many. He removed most of the additional internal surveillance, restored data access for long-time employees, and openly admitted that he had let anger take control. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was growth. Kevin chose to stay. The team gradually regained its rhythm. The mining season closed with stable output, but what lingered went far deeper than any ounce count. In the Klondike, gold can be mined every day. But trust, once damaged, takes time and humility to rebuild, and for Tony, that was the most valuable lesson of the entire season. As the mining season came to an end, Paradise Hill was no longer clouded by the same suspicious glances. Machines still roared across the wild Klondike land, gold still flowed through the sluice boxes, but the greatest change was in the people. For Tony Beets, this was not just another season of gold mining documented on Gold Rush Debt. This was the season he was forced to confront himself. Tony had always been known as tough, decisive, and sometimes uncompromising. But this incident made him realize that true power doesn't lie in controlling everything with steel and cameras, but in the ability to forgive and rebuild trust. He began spending more time speaking directly with his team, listening instead of just giving orders. Meetings were no longer only about gold output, but about how people felt about their work and about each other. That change didn't happen overnight. The wound left by betrayal was still there. But instead of letting it become an excuse for permanent suspicion, Tony chose to turn it into a lesson. He understood that if he wanted future generations to continue this work, Paradise Hill had to be a place people wanted to belong, not a place they feared. If you believe that the stories behind the gold are more valuable than the gold itself, make sure to follow the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next on Gold Rush. And don't forget to leave a comment. In a harsh environment like the Klondike, what matters more, gold or trust?